Imagine a hallway that points to a star that doesn't rise anymore. That's our doorway. In the desert hush, a beam of moonlight slides along a corridor cut before history had a surname. And the numbers I brought, to be clever, to be right, suddenly sound like sandals on stone. The ancients called some stars imperishable, and tonight the word feels less like poetry, and more like engineering, a promise etched into limestone that the sky itself would keep. I steady my breath, trace a line with a string, and the darkness answers with a geometry older than our clocks. A voice unfurls from the carved walls, not in words but in choreography. Appear, vanish, return, like the river's pulse. Follow absence, the stones seem to say. Measure the quiet. I came to debunk legends, to tidy myths with data. But the corridor waits, aligned to a vanished rise, and I realize the riddle isn't whether they knew the stars. It's how they made the stars know us. The voice that meets me is not thunder but linen and patience. In the hush of a rooftop 4,000 years away, a priest sights a chord against the wheeling dark and names a circle that never sets. He calls them imperishables, not because they refuse death, but because they never dip below the horizon where our fears sleep. I can almost hear the hiss of his lamp, the scratch of reed on papyrus, the breath held at a perfect crossing. My own instruments are louder. Digital chirps, the tick of a thermal sensor, but his quiet is the steadier metronome. I realize the north they sought was not a point, but a conversation, a slow agreement between eyes, tools, and the unblinking hours. When he lowers the chord, the city below exhales. The axis is found. In that simple fall of string is a crown, a calendar, a promise that stone can keep true and kings cannot. There is a tenderness in tools that survive by shadows. The mason shows me how a wall can listen, a plumb bob humming in the faintest wind, a notch watching for first light like a pupil. He doesn't speak of math as conquest, only as a treaty with stone. I lean into the slot and a star greets me, late, off by our modern ephemerides, and yet perfectly on time by the corridor's memory. Perhaps precision is not a decimal but a rhythm, tested and retested across seasons until it agrees with the world's heartbeat. When he smiles, it is small and tired and proud, the smile of someone who has convinced granite to behave. I feel suddenly clumsy with my tripod and lasers. He, with cord and chalk, has stitched the horizon to a wall, so that someday a stranger could look through and see what he saw. And know he was right. The river pilot enters like dawn wrapped in cool water. She doesn't call the star by our catalog number. She calls it the flood's herald, the throat clearing before life returns. On her skiff, the air smells of wet reeds and clay ovens cooling along the bank. She reads the sky with her shoulders, balancing instinct against current. And when the bright one rises from invisibility, she grins as if an old friend has stepped ashore. My notes list heliacal rising, but her body records it differently in the timing of planting, in the weight of baskets, in the stories told to restless children. The stargazers of the court and the pilots of the river shared a clock you could not hold in your hand, only in your habits. Between them, a nation learned to breathe in sync with a star's return from silence. In a chamber warm with lamp breath, a court astronomer bends over diagonal lines that look at first glance like music. 36 groups, stepping across the night, bead by luminous bead, until dawn unlatches the door. He traces them with a finger heavy with ink and responsibility. The king's sleep, the temple's hymn, the embalmer's vigil, all must keep time with this procession. I hover in the doorway of the past, aware that our constellations will not sit obediently on his rows. Something is missing, a ciphered key, a name we no longer know how to pronounce. He lifts his gaze as if hearing my doubt and smiles a little. The trick, his eyes say, is that absence counts. Dark intervals are numbers too. I write it down. though I know the note will refuse to explain the warmth gathering at the edge of my certainty. The night opens like a ledger. Every hour a column, every star a moving sum, and I learned the word decan not as a label but as a rhythm. On coffin lids the lines run diagonally, patient as breathing, telling of a procession that carries sleepers from dusk to dawn. A finger traces the rows, pausing at the places where light hands the baton to the next spark, and I feel how time once walked on soft sandals rather than ticking in metal shoes. The idea is simple and strange: to measure darkness by arrivals that occur in order, to know that a missing step is still part of the dance. The more I study, the more the pattern refuses to lie flat. It lifts its head like a serpent and watches me back. Our constellations do not fit. Our names refuse to lock. Somewhere between memory and mistranslation, the night keeps its older grammar and invites me to listen without insisting I understand. To count a night without gears, you cradle water and string. A vessel whispers its measure with each drop, the surface dimpling like the skin of a quiet drum, and a sighting cord pulls a straight line through the heart of a turning sky. The tools are humble, yet they ask for a fierce kind of care. Level the rim or the time will tilt. Hold your breath or the plumb will lie. Two watchers call and answer across a rooftop, agreeing on moments by voice and patience, not machinery, and a city sleeps safely because of that pact. I set my modern clock beside theirs and feel a little ashamed. They trusted the weight of the world to fall straight. They trusted water to arrive as itself. To measure in the dark is to accept that the body is part of the instrument, that steadiness of hand and mind is the only guarantee. The night will keep its promises. The more precise the counting, the more the counts drift apart. A civil calendar runs like a clean road, 360 days and 5 at the margin, while the moon keeps its own counsel and a bright herald rises when it pleases after 70 days of silence. The people braided these tempos instead of forcing them to march in step. Festivals slid gently across the seasons, then circled home again after a long loop that outlived dynasties. What looks like error from a desk becomes mercy in a field. Sowing waits for water, not a date. Grief waits for the star to return, not a deadline. They knew the pleasure of a system that admits it is not the world, that can be corrected by observation, by patience, by feeling the ankle-deep silt between one's toes and saying, "Today, now." This is when the year begins. Some knowledge arrives by absence. The bright one vanishes for a season, sealed in daylight like a seed under soil, and its return is celebrated with fragrances and songs. In the records I find careful notations of invisibility, the days counted like beads with nothing to see, and I begin to understand why silence had a number. Crafts slow to a hush, bodies are tended with precision, the rooms made cool and fragrant while the sky recovers its missing syllable. It is not morbid, it is disciplined tenderness. The recognition that cycles include a resting arc. The night watchers preserved gaps as faithfully as they did gleams, because both are truthful. I mark the blank spaces in my notes and feel their weight, a new kind of data that smells of resin and linen, a reminder that what cannot be seen still shapes the story of when to act and when to wait. At last, I face the map that refuses to be translated. The deacons stare back like guests whose names I once knew. Scholars have proposed neat overlays, and each solution slips like water from the fingers. Perhaps that is the point. The sky they used was not ours, not because physics changed, but because attention carved it differently. Their groupings were shaped by river work, by temple rite, by who needed waking at what hour, and a pattern formed that matched their lives like a tailored garment. I redraw the chart without forcing it into modern squares, letting the lines bend toward usefulness rather than pride, and something relaxes in the page. The puzzle does not solve, yet it begins to speak. Precision sits beside story, both welcome, neither ashamed of the other, and the night becomes legible in a language I can read only with humility. Night steadies the stones until they feel less like walls and more like instruments waiting to be played. I am shown how a pyramid negotiates with the sky, its edges pleading for perfect cardinality, its corridors rehearsing a single narrow syllable of starlight. The trick is not faith in a frozen north. It is a conversation with paired circumpolar lights that exchange places as the hours turn, a moving crosshair that yields a truer stillness than any single point. Chalk marks fade, copper tools dull. Yet the angle remains, held by patience and repetition. I kneel where the air smells of dust and cold gypsum, and realize the blueprint was never only geometric. It was behavioral, a choreography that recruits the night itself as a surveyor. When a quiet beam arrives exactly where generations expected it, the stone earns its oath, and orientation becomes a promise that outlives the hands that set it. There are mornings when the sun behaves like a blade, a single cut through darkness that lands exactly where a story says it should. I stand inside a long stone throat and feel the warmth advance. A golden rectangle creeping over carved gods toward a hidden figure who waits in chill shadow. People once traveled for days to witness this moment, to see a temple wake in a burst of precision that feels like affection. Far upriver, another axis answers. A pylon holding the sky at midsummer and midwinter, as if time were a doorway with two hinges. What looks theatrical is in fact diagnostic. Light interrogates the alignment, and the sanctuary smiles or frowns. In that hush, I hear the confidence of builders who trusted their horizon, who tuned masonry to a calendar no hand can stop. And I understand why a beam of sunlight could be received as a royal visitor bearing proof, instead of awe. Merely brightness. Out on the desert flats, the temple reveals its secret anatomy. It is not a building, it is a sight line given a body. Low mounds stand like punctuation across a sentence of sand, cairns and posts and carefully chosen rocks that tell the eye where to rest. A notch in a far ridge holds the place of a winter sunrise. A whitewashed marker anchors the return of a bright star to the horizon. When wind erases footprints, the markers remain, and the structure reads the landscape like a long instrument plucked by seasons. I walk the line with a cord, counting my steps, feeling how distance turns into patience and patience into confidence. The miracle is not that the heavens align with a doorway. It is that a community agreed to maintain the path of attention across years, sweeping markers, retouching lime, teaching apprentices which stones matter and which are only stones. Ceiling becomes cosmos when a planner dares to draw the night indoors. In a quiet chamber, I study an ancient map of stars that arcs over painted goddesses, the figures both gentle and exact, their bodies bending to carry hours across the roof. Here, an official once chose to bind the sky to a biography, to make a tomb converse, with seasons in lines and tiny points. Far away and centuries later, a different ceiling gathers animals and signs we now recognize, a wheel of symbols that speaks another dialect of the same devotion. The continuity disorients me. Names change, empires fold, yet someone keeps lifting a brush to plot light in the dark, preserving a grammar of motion that refuses to die. These maps are not curiosities. They are instructions for remembering that the roof above sleep is also a calendar, and that a life can be measured in the interval between risings. The question slips in like cool wind. Did the builders hear the slow wobble deep in the sky, the long turning that takes lifetimes to complete? And if so, where did they hide the knowledge so that it would not be bruised by time? I chase hints in corridors and charts, in corridors that seem to drift from the target across generations, in names that hold both memory and metaphor. The temptation is to make a grand claim, to crown the past with everything we admire. The harder work is to listen for a restraint. Alignments can age without implying prophecy. Symbols can point to patience rather than arithmetic. I lay the theories side by side and let them breathe. What remains is beautiful, regardless. A culture that folded the sky into work and grief and celebration until orientation felt like kindness. Whether or not the slow cycle was seen entire, the lesson is clear. Measurement was a way to care for tomorrow. The year begins in a hush before language, when a single bright seed pricks the bruise of dawn, and the river seems to lean toward it like a listener. People once climbed rooftops with sleep still in their eyes, squinting into a grainy horizon, waiting for the herald to lift from its 70 days of hiding. When it did, songs started softly, then grew into laughter that you could hear across courtyards and water stairs. I watched the moment through notes and ruins, and feel how a nation learned to breathe on cue. How floodgates of effort opened because a point of light said now. The brilliance is not magic. It is choreography, the patient matching of habit to a sky that returns even when kings do not. The star rises, the river swells, the shutters open, and the calendar feels less like a table of numbers than a hand on the shoulder that says, begin again. Water keeps its own archive, etched on stone in quiet increments that outlast quarrels. At the river's stair, a shaft drops into cool shadow, and along its wall, a ladder of marks climbs from ancient drought to remembered plenty. I picture careful hands lowering a rod, murmuring the number, scratching a date, tying both to the color of the morning sky and the taste of silt on the tongue. The miracle is not that the measure exists, it is that it is public. A civic scripture that anyone can read if taught. A promise that the river's temper will be named before decisions are made. In that darkness, patience becomes policy. Roof repairs weight, granaries open, temples ration oil by the truthful height of water. The star announces, the stair confirms, and between the two, the city finds its balance like a walker on a rope who trusts both eyes and feet. Work listens to the sky with its sleeves rolled. In the fields, rhythm is a wiser teacher than decree. Sowing waits for the first faithful damp to lift the scent of mud, reaping bows to grain that rattles like small rain, and boats stack along banks when the channel speaks in a deeper voice. The pattern belongs to everyone, carried in the weight of baskets and the timing of lullabies, in the feel of oars against current at certain hours of night, when the deacons say, change crews. I run a finger along a chipped relief of farmers and barges and understand the tenderness in accuracy. A mistake here is not an abstract loss. It is a thin harvest and a restless winter. So the people stitch the sky to their chores with cords of memory, checking the stitch at dawn, adjusting at dusk, forgiving drift with the humility of those who know that nature is a partner rather than a servant. Silence has a number, and here it is kept with tenderness. For 70 days the bright herald is swallowed by daylight, and in that interval rooms are cooled, bodies anointed, linens folded with the precision of promises. The city moves with a softer tread, as if walking inside a heartbeat that is saving its strength for the return. Records mark emptiness with the same care given to omens, and a craft that faces grief each morning learns to count absence like a prayer. I stand at the threshold of a chamber that smells of resin and water, and understand why the calendar needed a lull. Why every system of measurement must admit rest as a legitimate entry. To tend the hidden is to believe in the cycle itself. When the star returns, it does not erase the quiet days. It crowns them. Without the measured hush, the festival would be only brightness, rather than the end of longing. Toward midnight, the river goes glassy and the sky leans close, and a pilot speaks the truth that mathematics sometimes forgets. What saves a voyage is not only a calculation, it is the practiced feel of current against ankle, the way the wind changes sentence when a certain star touches a certain reed, the memory of elders who read both eddies and heavens without hurry. I listen to the confession and hear a curriculum that never needed a school, only apprentices willing to be patient in the dark. Instruments help, calendars reassure, but the living body finishes the equation. The oar dips when a deacon peaks. The turn is taken when the smell of damp clay deepens, the landing made when shore dogs begin to bark. In that web of cues, a culture tied precision to care, proving that knowledge worth keeping is the kind that leaves room for breath. The names resist me like guarded wells. I whisper them aloud from a fragment, careful of consonants that carry dust, and feel how each title once pointed to more than a dot in the dark. These were not labels that travel cleanly into our charts. They were jobs, temperaments, warnings, lullabies for night watchmen. A deacon might be a ferryman one century and a healer the next, because usefulness mattered more than our wish for a fixed map. I try to force an overlay, and the page tightens, its lines protesting. Then I let the words remain slightly ajar and something opens. The sky becomes local again, braided into errands and festivals, into who wakes whom at the third watch, into which corridor waits for which glimmer. We want a one-to-one. They wanted a one-to-many, a web that holds when threads break. The failure to translate becomes its own lesson. The night does not belong to the tidy. Secrets in this place are not fences. They are thresholds that teach slowness. A record hints that certain star lists were spoken only after purification, that a watcher learned steps in a courtyard before being allowed onto the roof. I bristle at first, imagining gatekeeping, then hear the quieter reason. Knowledge that steers a nation must be carried by bodies trained to steadiness, because a trembling hand can tilt time itself. The rites temper the witness. Hands are washed that will hold cords. Silence is practice that will count invisibility. I picture an initiate standing with heart pounding as the teacher nods and the city murmurs far below. No drums, no spectacle, only the soft click of responsibility settling into place. The night is all invitation, yet it asks for people who can keep promises. Secrecy, in that light, becomes a kindness that keeps the sky from being shouted into error. We lose what rots first. The most eloquent instruments were made of what the river loved to reclaim. Wood for sighting rods, cord for straightness, water for time. Stone survives and tries to tell the story, but the script is missing its verbs. I hold a splintered merket from a later age and feel more guided by its wear than by any treatise. Grooves where fingers learn to rest, a stain where oil kept the fiber line from fraying. The gaps in our reconstructions are not only scholarly, they are tactile. We lack the calluses that come from nights on roofs, from wind tugging cord, from counting drops through winter. Perhaps this is why the past sometimes seems occult. It is simply manual, and we are out of practice. The elegance here was never in a grand device. It was in the way humble materials were taught to converge on truth with a patience no museum label can display. I was taught to separate symbol from measurement, as if poetry were a contaminant. Here, the two sit shoulder to shoulder and neither flinches. A star can be a god without losing its coordinates. A corridor can be a throat for dawn and still pass an audit of angles. The Mason's line does not fear the hymn. In fact, the hymn helps because devotion keeps the line tended across generations when budgets fail. I stand before a relief where a goddess holds a ceiling of stars in her outstretched body, and I see a calendar wearing a face, a schedule learning to sing. This is not superstition pasted over science. It is a mutual reinforcement, a cultural alloy that resists corrosion. You remember to clean the sighting notch because it is sacred. You trust the measurement because it is beautiful. In that partnership, precision stops being cold and becomes a way to keep faith with harvest and sleep. The old astronomer leaves me a riddle that feels like breath held in the dark. He points not to a star, but to a blank interval on a table of nights, and asks what time it is when nothing appears. I answer clumsily, reach for terms that sound competent, and he waits until my words fall away. Then I hear it. The missing is a measure, The hush is a number. The watcher who can keep company with absence without panic is the one who will greet the return without surprise. I try it on the roof, counting the quiet as carefully as the gleams, and the night grows more articulate. Silence divides into kinds: expectant, restful, warning. Each has its length, its temperature. By dawn, I feel both chastened and enlarged. The ledger of heaven was never meant to be filled to the edges. It needed margins wide enough for patience to write in. The first lesson of the late watch is that the body carries a clock older than any calendar. Eyes dilate, breath lengthens, muscles forget the day's quickness and learn the longer patience of night. On a rooftop, I practice the old discipline: no coffee, no chatter, only the slow swing of a plum and the subtle ache behind the eyes that means the third watch has begun. The deacons arrive like steps in a familiar hallway. One, then the next, then a pause that tastes different from fatigue. The priest beside me counts in whispers, not numbers but breaths, and I realize why training mattered more than instruments. Exhaustion is a lens that warps minutes into smudges. Only a softened body, tuned by repetition, can keep time clean when cold climbs the spine. Dawn does not reward the frantic. It finds the steady. By the pale edge of east, my heartbeat and the water clock finally agree, and the roof becomes a quiet metronome. Error here is not a sin. It is a guest given a seat and watched closely. I learn the ritual redundancies: 2 watchers, 2 chords, 2 marks made a breath apart, then a third to break the tie. The water clock's rim is leveled twice. The plums swing timed both by eye and by a chant whose syllables match the fall. The record keeps each attempt, not just the winner, so that drift has a family tree. Modern notes would compress this into a tidy mean. Their method prefers a chorus. If an alignment agrees across voices, across nights, and across seasons, confidence becomes a communal property rather than a solitary boast. I feel my shoulders unclench. The courage here is not in claiming perfection, but in building rails that guide human fallibility toward truth. The night forgives small tremors when the work is shared, and measurement becomes a kind of liturgy that keeps arrogance from overruling patience. Stones age like memories, mostly faithful, sometimes sly. Every generation returns to the line to ask if the world has shifted, or if the mortar has learned a new language in the heat. The heirs do not treat the ancestors' cut as inviolable. They treat it as a vow to be renewed. Chalk dust blooms, chords are stretched. A child is lifted to the sight slot to learn what the elders see. The corridor's beam comes late by a finger's breadth, then early the next year, and the ledger notes it without panic. I begin to love this refusal of brittle piety. Precision survives because humility refreshes it. An alignment is not a relic. It is a relationship that requires visits. When the star returns to its appointed slit, exactly on the anniversary of a founder's death, the old injury of weather and time feels mended, not by miracle, but by care layered carefully, as if fidelity itself were a tool. Catastrophe edits the calendar with a heavy hand. A season arrives thin and mean. The river shallow as a whisper, and the beloved star keeps its promise without bringing the flood that songs expect. In the records I read how the people answered, by adding watch nights, by opening granaries earlier, by moving a festival 2 hands along the ledger, so grief could breathe. Misalignment becomes teacher, not scandal. Priests walk the banks counting cracks in the mud as carefully as decans, and pilots share rumors of new channels cut by stubborn water. Rites grow a limb. Measurements gain a caution. The system flexes rather than fractures, and I feel a modern envy prick the heart. We crave certainty that does not bend. They built one that survived by bending at need. When the rains finally return, the new entries stay inked, a memory sewn into the year to honor the lesson carved by want. At last, a fragment surfaces from a storeroom's patient dust, a slim board. inscribed with star names and minute cuts along its edge, as if someone had taught wood to remember intervals. I test it against the night and feel a shiver of competence I cannot wholly parse. The device seems to marry the march of decans to the rate of a falling thread, translating motion into lengths a mason could cut by day and trust by moon. Our software can imitate, but not inhabit, the nuance of hands that tuned it with breath and weather. The old astronomer would smile at my eagerness and remind me that a method without a culture is only a diagram. Still, the board sings. It suggests a precision that was never brittle, a portable knight folded into grain and grew. I copy it carefully and fail, happily to exhaust its secret, knowing that some knowledge is most faithful when it remains partly hidden. Night settles like a patient teacher, and I lay out the old lesson with nothing more than cord, peg, bowl, and breath. A line is stretched from rooftop parapet to a notched staff, a water clock steadied with a folded scrap so its rim is true, and I begin the vigil that others once kept when empires were young. The first decan steps into the east and I answer with a mark, then another, then the pause that has its own flavor, neither mistake nor delay. Simply the body of darkness making room for the next arrival. A breeze lifts the cord, and I hold still until its trembling passes into agreement with the stars. The clock dimples and smooths, and I realize why this practice feels like prayer. It takes both attention and mercy to count the night without breaking it. By the time dawn teases the parapet, a simple map has formed beneath my hands, and I can read in it a memory older than my questions. The corridor receives morning as if it has been practicing all year. I wait at the threshold with my breath held even, watching a pale blade walk the floor. It finds the chalk ghost of older checks, glides up the wall, and rests on a carved figure that has stood through dynasties of wind and dust. Nothing explodes. There is only the soft verdict of accuracy, a warmth that brushes stone, and then my wrist, a remark made by light to masonry that says yes. Whatever doubts arrived with me are still welcome at the edge of the beam, but they lose their appetite. This is not superstition keeping a promise. It is geometry made human by patience, a confirmation that the relationship between sky and corridor is intact enough to feel like affection. I lower my notes and simply let it happen. The brief visit of the sun to its old appointment before it moves on, and the room exhales into shadow again. On the roof again I feel a presence that needs no words. In the long quiet before full day, I imagine the elder at my side. Not as a ghost, but as a habit of attention that has learned to wear a face. He points with a cord instead of a finger, and I hear the last lesson in the way he waits. Permanence, he suggests, is not a fixed point. It is a pattern of returning that can survive the small shivers of weather and time. The stars that never set are called imperishable, not because they refuse change, but because their circle is honest enough to include it. He lowers the cord, and the horizon looks less like an edge than a covenant. I understand why confidence here was never loud. It was a quiet agreement to keep tending alignments so they keep tending us. The lamp gutters, the sky pales, and with it, my need to argue. The lesson fits without forcing. I nod and put the tools away. What remains unsolved no longer itches like defeat. It glows with a steadier temperature, like embers that keep the room warm after the fire is done bragging. I list the questions I cannot close. Which decan names belong to which lights across the centuries? Whether slow shifts were sensed as arithmetic or as parable. How absence was graded into shades of meaning I can feel but not grasp. Each one refuses to be pinned without losing its pulse, and I begin to suspect that this is the point. The strength of their skywork was never in a single equation. It was in the weave that bound story to schedule, stone to watchman, reed boat to heliacal shimmer. We inherit fragments and think we are starved, yet the fragments teach appetite of the right kind. They draw us back out under the open dark to practice patience where certainty would only make us sleepy. The mystery stays, and with it, company. At the desert's edge, night loosens its grip by degrees, and one bright point lifts from the horizon as if remembering an old promise. I stand without tools, and let the return do the counting for me. The ground smells of cooling dust, and somewhere, a dog answers morning with a single bark. I think of hands that kept cords straight, of rooms that learned to hold sunlight like a secret, of boats that waited for the right quiver in the current. And I feel how the labor and the tenderness were always the same practice, with different names. The star climbs a finger's breadth, and the question that brought me here softens into invitation. We do not need to own what we cannot finish. We can belong to it. I close my eyes long enough to hear the quiet, then open them and give the rising another name. Not to replace the old one, only to add a small thread of gratitude to the tapestry that outlasts us.